gathered this morning as a Patrick Fogarty community in remembrance and gratitude. In remembrance for so many who gave of themselves to ensure peace, dignity, and freedom. In gratitude for the blessed lifestyle that we are gifted with simply by living in Canada.
Presently, Canadian soldiers continue to protect the rights and liberties of people around the world. As Canadians, we do not always recognize the freedoms we enjoy every day. It is important that we see these freedoms and thank those who fought for them. We look to the future by remembering what our British soldiers from the past did for us and carry this lesson into our everyday lives by continuing to stand up for those who cannot fight for their own freedoms. By this, we look to the past and appreciate the future.
We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we too must lay down our lives for one another.
Today we are going to discuss the events that led to Canada's military service in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. And of course, these events occurred on 9/11. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, forever remembered as 9/11. This is a picture that Mrs. Healy took when she was in New York City with high school students in April prior to 9/11. These are the twin towers that dominated the city skyline. The New York City skyline was and is one of the most photographed skylines in the world. The twin towers were one of the targets that were hit on September 11, 2001. The terrorist group behind the attacks was Al-Qaeda. Their leader was Osama bin Laden. Like all terrorist groups, they had their own interpretations of reality and used violence in an attempt to achieve their political goals. On that Tuesday in September, people were going about their usual business. Some of the current staff at PF were here then, as seen on this slide. Some of the other current teachers now may have been students here at PF on that day. It was one of the days that they simply and undoubtedly will never forget. But for most of us here today, we weren't even born yet, and it is really important that we learn about what happened on that day, the tragic events, the terrible loss of life, and how it changed things. Mr. Healy was teaching in a portable during period 1, and he set the student down with the attendance, as the school is not using the internet to record attendance yet. When the student came back, they said they heard a plane had flown into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. During second period, another student went down with the attendance and reported back that the second tower had been hit by another plane, although the incident had occurred about an hour prior to the student finding out. Unless you were glued to the TV, you were not getting instant information about the chaos that was occurring, like you might today, with widespread cell phone use. Rumors slowly started to trickle that Al-Qaeda might be responsible for the attacks. The first plane that hit the Twin Towers, American Airlines Flight 11, departed from Boston's Logan International Airport at 7:59 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. Aboard were 11 crew members and 81 passengers, including 5 hijackers. Its eventual flight path is shown here in purple. At 8:46 a.m., the hijackers on Flight 11 flew the airplane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The impact occurred between floors 93 and 99. The crash instantly killed hundreds, including all those on board. Almost immediately, emergency responders were sent to the building. United Airlines Flight 175, which also took off from Boston, departed at 8:14 a.m. and had 5 hijackers aboard. It was also supposed to go to LA, but it was redirected by the hijackers. Its flight path is shown here in orange. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, striking between floors 77 and 85. Once again, hundreds were instantly killed. Others would jump from the building, burn to death, or be buried in the eventual rubble. When the first plane hit the North Tower, U.S. President George Bush was on his way to Florida Elementary School to listen to students participating in a reading program. When interviewed by CBS 60 Minutes, The president said when he was told of the first plane hitting the tower, his reaction was, "I just thought it was an accident, thought it was pilot error. I thought some foolish soul had gotten lost and made a terrible mistake." In the image in this slide, his chief of staff is informing him about the second plane hitting the second tower. His exact words to the president were, "America is under attack." George Bush said that when he was told this, he knew America was at war. American Airlines Flight 77, with 5 hijackers aboard, departed from an airport in Virginia at 8:20 a.m. It was headed to LA, but the hijackers redirected it towards America's military headquarters. Its flight path is shown here in green. At 9:37 a.m., with the throttle set to maximum power, the hijackers flew the plane into the Pentagon building in Virginia. In addition to the 64 passengers on the plane, 125 people on the ground and in the building were ultimately killed. At 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 departed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey, headed to San Francisco. Aboard were 7 crew members and 37 passengers, including 4 hijackers. Its flight path is shown here in red. After the hijackers took control, the passengers fought back and the plane crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. The believed intended target was the Capitol building, or the White House, in Washington, D.C., only 18 minutes away. All on board were killed. This would be the last attack, but no one knew that at the time. People thought more things were going to happen later that day, the next day, or whenever. No one knew for sure. Airports around the world were shut down, and people in our own country weren't sure if Canadian cities would be targeted. In all, nearly 3,000 people were killed in the 9/11 attacks, including 24 Canadians. 4 airplanes had been used as the weapons of war, and the target chosen were intentional, not random. The targets were all symbols of the American system. The World Trade Center symbolized American wealth. The Pentagon is the military headquarters for the United States, and the intended targets of the Capitol building, or the White House, symbolized America's political system of democracy and elected officials. Canada shares many of the same democratic values as the United States, and in many ways, the terrorists attacked the very concept of democracy. Many things changed after 9/11. Many of those living in democratic countries started to lose some of those civil liberties through laws brought in like Bill C-36 in Canada and the Patriot Act in the US in order for the governments to have more power over surveillance of its citizens. Security at airports changed drastically, and discrimination and paranoia levels were elevated. These attacks took place all on American soil, but the violence shook the entire world. The US government asked for a coalition of countries to respond to Al-Qaeda. Yet this was not a conventional war where one country declares war on another. This was a war on terror, a war against a terror organization. So where would the coalition force go to confront Al-Qaeda? That would be Afghanistan, because Afghanistan's government at the time was the Taliban, and it openly funded terrorist training camps for Al-Qaeda and refused to turn over the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. They're harboring a terrorist. The war was not with the people of Afghanistan, it was with the Taliban and its defenders. Deployment of foreign troops to Afghanistan began October 7, 2001, when the US, together with the UK, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. They were joined by some 43 NATO allies and partners, including Canada. Many Canadian armed forces were stationed in the southern province of Kandahar. In fact, later in our service, we will have a guest speaker who happens to be my neighbor's daughter, and she was stationed in Kandahar. More than 40,000 Canadian Armed Forces members served in Afghanistan as part of the NATO International Security Assistance Force from 2001 to 2014, making it the largest Canadian military deployment since the Second World War. The Canadian military tallies the death toll for Canadians in Afghanistan at 158. But as the Canadian War Museum points out, thousands of other veterans of the war were wounded physically and psychologically, leading to additional deaths by suicide. One of those injured was former PF student Mike McTeague. On September 18, 2006, 20-year-old McTeague was on patrol near Kandahar City. A suicide bomber, pretending to be an ordinary citizen, was pushing a bicycle, biding his time until the Canadian soldiers were approaching, and then blew himself up. The bags strapped to the bicycle were filled with ball bearings, and they tore through the soldiers and Afghan civilians with horrifying effect. 4 Canadians were killed, and more than a dozen soldiers and civilians were injured. Both of McTeague's legs and feet were broken. He had taken shrapnel through his bowel, and a ball bearing had torn through his neck, passing just millimeters from his spine. He was flown to a hospital in Germany and was not expected to survive. But after months of rehab, miraculously, he did. These are just some of the events that occurred on 9/11. This short presentation cannot capture the shock and tragedy experienced on that day, but hopefully it gives us a little better understanding of what did happen and provides us with something to reflect upon. Today we are fortunate to have with us Elise Clarge, who as a member of the Canadian military served in Afghanistan in 2010. She has taken time out of her day today to share with us her experiences. Elise is currently a member of the Barrie Police Force and is an avid animal lover. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good morning, staff and students of Patrick Fogarty Catholic Secondary School. I'm truly honored to stand before you today on the solemn occasion of Remembrance Day. Thank you for inviting me to share my story with your community. I vividly remember the day at age 17 that I made the impulsive decision to join the Canadian military. A recruiter appeared at my high school, and without much thought, I found myself signing up. In those days, social media was in its infancy, and information about military life was limited. The recruitment drive, with its questions like, do you like camping, and do you like being physical, seemed to offer a departure from the norm, even if it was entirely misrepresented. This decision wasn't what many expected from a young woman who grew up from Richmond Hill, especially one from a family with very liberal views. My parents later on admitted that they thought this was just a phase that, like many impulsive teenage decisions, I would eventually move on to something else. At that time, I wasn't entirely sure of my life's direction. I had ideas, but I felt a lack of purpose. Joining the military seemed like a departure from the expected path that my friends and family seemed to be on. But serving the country was not something entirely removed from my family. One of my grandfathers had been a part of the infantry and contributed to the liberation of Holland from Nazi occupation during the events of World War II. My Zeta, Hebrew for grandfather, was also stationed in England, working as a clerk in the Air Force. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to ask them about their time in the Canadian Forces, as like many veterans, they rarely spoke of it. By the time I had decided to join, both had passed away. Being half Jewish, the events of World War II carried a deeper and personal significance for my family and I. Growing up, I had always admired those who served, like my grandfathers, who saved the lives and to combat evil. By the age of 17, in the mid-2000s, Canada's involvement in Afghanistan was still relatively new. I believe that if I wanted to follow in my grandfather's footsteps and contribute to the effort of stopping evil, this was my time. Looking back, I acknowledge the naivete of my thoughts at the time. Deep down, my decision to join the military was to continue the legacy of my family and contribute to the cause of someone from my family dedicated their life to stopping evil. However, the reality of military life differed from the images painted by recruitment posters and movies. A significant portion of my early military experience was spent asking myself, what have I done? And being way too stubborn to quit and move on, as was expected by my friends and family. At 17, my naive desire was to jump into active duty, participate in humanitarian work worldwide, shoot guns, and be an everyday badass. The reality, especially for newcomers, was quite different. The first challenge was basic training, which I completed in the summer of 2005 in Meaford, Ontario. Life there consisted of living in large canvas tents that accommodated 11 colleagues, all of whom were male. Privacy was non-existent, with the small canvas cots providing the only separation of a 4 by 8 foot bunk space. Days began at 4 a.m. with a run, followed by hours of classroom lectures covering military history, operations, tactics, and more. Physical activities included shooting guns, throwing grenades, were all a part of training, but the experience wasn't as glamorous as it may sound. The base restrictions meant no leaving, no cell phone reception, and an average of 4 hours sleep per night. And the mosquitoes were the size of small cats. Did I enjoy it? Absolutely. I forged incredible friendships and became a part of a motivated community dedicated to serving and becoming the best soldiers we could be. Many of you might not remember the events of 9/11, but for me and others of my generation, it left an indelible mark. I was in grade 7, sitting at my desk when the news of the World Trade Center was coming down reached us. The gravity of the situation was beyond our comprehension at the time, but it was clear this was significant. The next several years were dedicated to training and courses to enhance my military skills. My career took me all across North America in various roles and tasks. One highlight, particularly early on in my time, was with the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, also known as CSOR, from 2007 to 2008. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that if I wanted legitimacy in my military career, I too would have to go to Afghanistan. Did I want to go? Honestly, no. Coming from a liberal home where my parents initially didn't support the idea of their youngest daughter running off to join the army, and being unconvinced about the purpose of our presence there, my focus within the military was more humanitarian relief and disaster response. With more friends returning from war with stories of resilience and fortitude, I made the decision to be a part of the mission. I didn't inform my family immediately, knowing the reservations about Canada's involvement in Afghanistan. I told them I was going to fight forest fires in British Columbia, revealing my true destination only 1 month before my departure. While they couldn't stop me, they weren't entirely thrilled with my choice, but they did support me. Despite their disagreement with Canada's presence in Afghanistan, they believed their daughter's good intention would bring about a positive impact. I deployed in March of 2010, bound for Kandahar, Afghanistan. The first thing that struck me upon my arrival was the heat, a dry, hot air that induced sweat from every single pore. My station was Kandahar Air Base, where I lived in what we called big-ass tents that housed around 100 of us. Initially assigned to logistical roles, my involvement of driving armored vehicles in convoys and delivering supplies to various bases around the camps. My role also included security and training to provide rapid medical care if needed. In Afghanistan, we were there at a time known as fighting season, marked by increased Taliban activity. Daily life involved hearing distant explosions, frequent encounters with the enemy, who, just as quickly as they appeared, would disappear back into the population. When a coalition soldier is killed, the entire camp would gather on the airfield for what we would call ramp ceremony. The fallen soldier's body would be led through the ranks and loaded into the aircraft bound for home. I lost count of how many ramp ceremonies I attended. To this day, the sound of the last post and Amazing Grace transports me back to that airfield. Watching the bodies of my colleagues being walked down in a single row, feeling the searing heat on the tarmac of my feet and face, while those around me wept. This year, with the loss of many Canadian police officers, that feeling has returned. Let me not get ahead of my story. Over time, my role in Afghanistan evolved, and I became more involved in camp security and interpreting liaison duties. This unique position allowed me to engage with Afghan civilians, assisting them with their daily needs. Soon, I found myself organizing my own mini humanitarian missions, bringing about supplies from home to distribute to the local villages, everything from toys, school supplies, and even veterinary care for their animals. Months passed, and I ventured either by vehicle or helicopter to various camps, assisting the locals with their tasks and delivering supplies. My team comprised of a Slovakian security force, many of whom spoke little English but were the size of mature oak trees, and Americans who knew very little about Canada but relied on me heavily to deliver them Tim Hortons whenever I was able to. During downtime, I would watch soldiers from across the globe play hockey against my fellow Canadians, a chaotic spectacle. I also secretly owned a small dirt bike that I would venture out, which in hindsight was a very risky adventure in that desert. I could share hours of stories of my time in Afghanistan, but time constraints require me to move forward. Upon my return in 2010, I decided to specialize in the medical field. Afghanistan had provided a unique insight into combat medicine, inspiring me to dedicate the rest of my career to this field. The military's educational benefits allowed me to pursue college while serving. I enrolled in paramedicine at Lambton College, and after 2 years, left with my civilian paramedicine diploma, followed by more military-specific medical training. The next few years were dedicated to advancing the medical field, specializing in nuclear, biological, and chemical medicine, as well as high-altitude and mountain operation medicine. The journey eventually led me to Trenton, where I spent the last of my 6 years in the military, treating soldiers at the airbase while deploying as a medic with units like the Skyhawks, Pathfinders, and Mountain Operations Team with the Advanced Warfare Center. I was ultimately selected to represent Canada in the Starlight Challenge, a unique medical competition that took me to Europe, where my team and I competed against other countries in combat medical skills and scenarios. I loved my time in the Army, but as I approached my 30s and recently married, the constant travel and separation from my family prompted a realization. I needed a change, yet I still desired to serve Canadians. I opted for a career in law enforcement, becoming a police officer with the Barrie Police Service. Contrary to the notion of seeking a grass is greener scenario, this transition was more a change of pasture within a similar landscape. Policing allowed me to apply the views and experiences gained during my military service to everyday domestic roles. Every police officer, I believe, offers a unique perspective shaped by their experiences. Coming from an advanced combat medical role, I knew that I was ready to handle stress and trauma. This readiness has been tested in numerous instances, dealing with violent crimes committed against members of our community by those seeking to do harm. Policing has provided me with the opportunity to continue to serve my community and fellow Canadians. However, it is a different avenue compared to the military. Policing has opened my eyes to the realization that evil isn't confined to foreign lands. It exists in our home cities. One doesn't need to go to war to witness this truth. Like the Taliban disappearing back into the population, evil within Canada can hide in plain sight, and it requires a trained eye to see it. As I look around the room, I am delighted to see a strong diversity of cultures. You may not be aware why your parents chose to come to Canada. Canada for them and for all of us is a place where civil rights and liberties are guaranteed. Freedom of expression, religion, and mobility, the right to life, security, and justice are fundamental principles that men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces have sacrificed their lives to preserve. Perhaps for some of you, relating to the causes championed by adults is challenging. Yet, I joined at 17 and found myself in Afghanistan at 23. If I could impart one message to the Canadian youth of today, it would be this: Western ideals that value life on equal terms are not universally shared across the globe. The stark reality is that evil exists. Many of us in our lifetimes have been fortunate to avoid experiencing the violence of war on our home soil, making it challenging for some to truly grasp the perspective of what it means to appreciate peace. I acknowledge that this may not be the case for several individuals in this room. Some of you may have come from countries where lasting peace was a distant dream, where you faced famine, oppression, or the horrors of war. While Canada is far from perfect, we are blessed to know a level of peace that not everyone has had a privilege to experience. However, for those who don't have the experience, I implore you to not let that sense of security cloud your vision of the rest of the world. We find ourselves in a unique moment of time where conflicts and wars are being waged over matters we thought were left in the past. The current global landscape is marked by complexity, and staying informed by watching the news and scrolling through social media or discussing with your friends does not provide perspective. Real perspective is gained by going out into the world, living it for yourself. I must caution you that the consequences is that you may not like what you see and learn, but the reality, that's it. As we stand here today, it is crucial to acknowledge the interconnectedness of our world. Wars are not distant narratives. They impact real lives, real communities, and shape destiny of nations. As you move forward, consider this. Embrace unique privilege of living in a country that values peace, but remain vigilant to the global realities that demand our attention and empathy. Now, as I reflect on the words of Paul Fussell, literary scholar and World War II veteran, I am reminded of the profound impact war has had on individuals and societies. His reflection on the victory of Europe in 1945, where he wrote, "So many bright figures consigned to the ashes of the past, so many dreams lost in madness that have engulfed us." Each year on Remembrance Day, we renew our commitment to honor and remember the bravery, suffering, and sacrifice. We tell and retell stories aspiring for lasting peace. Thank you for listening to me speak today. It has been a tremendous privilege, and if any of you have any questions, I would be more than happy to stick around a little while, and if you would like to come up to me at the end, I'd be happy to speak with you.
We gather at cenotaphs and memorials in over 2,000 cities, towns, and villages throughout the country. We stand with our heads bowed and we wear a poppy. We take part in a simple but very moving ceremony to honor the many Canadians who were killed in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, our mission in Afghanistan, and on United Nations peacekeeping operations throughout the world. During the 2 minutes of silence, we think of these brave people who are in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Please stand in silence.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, till dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.